r/NoSleep. My boyfriend talks in his sleep. He's been telling me secrets I shouldn't know. I was in love. Utterly in love. The kind that makes your chest ache and your thoughts spiral. The kind that feels too good, too intense, too overwhelming. And yet, I couldn't help but drown in it. Jake was everything I ever wanted: kind, attentive, smart, and charming in a way that made me feel like the only person in the room. We hadn't been together long, only a few months, but it felt like I had known him forever. But lately, something was off. At first, it was little things. The way he'd space out during conversations as though lost in thought. The nights he'd stay over but would wake up looking as if he hadn't slept at all. And then there was his sleep talking. He didn't warn me about it. The first time it happened, I thought he was having a bad dream. He mumbled something unintelligible, tossing and turning beside me. I leaned over to shake him awake, but he snapped his head toward me with his eyes closed and muttered, "Don't touch me." It startled me, but I brushed it off. Everyone has strange sleep habits, right? But the nights that followed made me realize this was more than just sleep talking. It started getting specific. "Why are you looking for it?" he mumbled one night, his voice flat, his breathing shallow. "You won't like what you find." I thought maybe he was dreaming about work. He was a software engineer and often mentioned how stressful his projects could be. But the more he talked in his sleep, the stranger it became. One night, as I drifted off to sleep, he rolled onto his back and whispered, "Do you think she knows?" I blinked awake. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the ceiling fan. I turned to face him, but his eyes were shut. His lips moved again. "She doesn't know. She'll ruin it if she finds out." "Jake?" I whispered, nudging his shoulder. He didn't respond. The next morning, I asked him about it. He laughed it off. "Oh yeah, I talk in my sleep sometimes. My ex used to joke about it." Weird, right? I didn't think much of it then, but as the nights went on, his sleep talking became darker. More vivid. "Don't go in there," he said one night. His voice was low, guttural. Not at all like the gentle tone I was used to. "You don't belong here." I sat up, staring at him. He was perfectly still, his face relaxed, as though he were in a deep sleep. But his voice came again, louder this time. "If you open that door, you'll never come out." "What door?" The next morning, I asked him again about his sleep talking. This time, he avoided the question. "I don't remember what I dream about," he said, his tone clipped. "Why do you keep asking?" I didn't have an answer for him. I just felt like there was something he wasn't telling me. Something I needed to know. Then last night happened. Jake had invited me to his apartment for the weekend. It was our first time spending a full 2 days together, and I was excited. His place was cozy, filled with little touches that made it feel like him: books stacked haphazardly on shelves, a record player that always seemed to have a vinyl spinning, and a faint smell of cedarwood and cologne. We went to bed around midnight, and I fell asleep almost instantly. But a loud noise woke me in the middle of the night. It was Jake. He was sitting upright, his hands gripping the sheets so tightly his knuckles turned white. His eyes were closed, but his mouth moved rapidly. "They're watching you," he whispered. "They know you're here." "Jake?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "They see you," he continued, his head tilting unnaturally to the side. "They'll come for you next." I froze. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at him. He began to laugh, a low, guttural sound that didn't seem human. And then, without warning, he turned his head sharply toward me. His eyes were open now, but they were wrong. Clouded. Empty. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking through me. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice deeper than I thought possible. "Jake, wake up," I said, my voice trembling. I reached out to shake him, but he grabbed my wrist, hard. "Don't touch me," he snarled, his grip like a vice. His lips curled into a twisted smile. "You'll find it soon. And then it'll be too late." He let go of my wrist and collapsed back onto the pillow, his breathing steadying as if nothing had happened. I scrambled out of bed, my heart racing. What did he mean? What would I find? I spent the rest of the night on his couch, clutching a blanket as I stared at the bedroom door, half expecting it to burst open. When morning came, I went back to the bedroom, my knees shaking. Jake was still asleep, his face peaceful and calm. I thought about waking him, demanding an explanation. But something stopped me. Something told me that I wasn't ready to know. As I turned to leave, I noticed something on his nightstand. A small, leather-bound journal. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. I opened it. The first few pages were filled with sketches, symbols, runes, things I couldn't understand. But as I flipped through, I found something that made my blood run cold. It was a list. A list of names. My name was the last one, written in bold letters with today's date beside it. I slammed the journal shut and backed away, my hands trembling. Jake stirred in bed, mumbling something under his breath. I didn't wait to hear what he'd say next. I grabbed my keys and left his apartment, my heart pounding in my chest. As I drove away, I tried to tell myself that it was all just a bad dream, that there was a rational explanation for everything. But deep down, I knew the truth. Jake wasn't just talking in his sleep. He was warning me. But warning me about what? My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white as I sped down the dark, empty road. The early morning sky was just starting to lighten, but the shadows still clung stubbornly to the corners of my vision. I tried to calm myself, to convince myself that it was just a coincidence. That maybe I was overreacting. But I couldn't shake the image of that list in Jake's journal. Why was my name there? Why today's date? I couldn't go back to my apartment, I didn't feel safe there anymore. Jake knew where I lived. And if whatever was happening to him had something to do with me, I needed space. Answers. A place to think. I pulled into a small diner on the outskirts of town, its flickering neon sign buzzing faintly in the pre-dawn silence. Inside, the smell of stale coffee and fried food hit me like a wall, but the familiarity of it was strangely comforting. I slid into a booth at the back, my back to the wall, where I could see the entrance. The waitress, an older woman with tired eyes and a forced smile, came over to take my order. I asked for coffee, black, and she nodded without a word, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I couldn't stop replaying Jake's words in my head. They're watching you. They'll come for you next. And then the twisted smile. I shivered, wrapping my arms around myself as though I could ward off the creeping chill that had settled in my bones. The coffee arrived, but I barely touched it. Instead, I pulled out my phone, scrolling through every message Jake had ever sent me, looking for, I didn't even know what. Some kind of clue, maybe. Something that would explain what was happening. And then I saw it. One of his messages from weeks ago. Something I had dismissed at the time as a joke. You ever wonder what's on the other side of the door? He had written. What door? I had replied, confused. He never answered. A sudden noise snapped me out of my thoughts, a man coughing loudly near the counter, and I realized my heart was racing again. I couldn't sit here forever. I needed answers, and there was only one person who could give them to me. Jake. I didn't want to go back to his apartment, but I couldn't leave this unresolved. If there was any chance he was in danger, or if I was in danger, I needed to know. I paid for the coffee and left a tip before stepping back out into the morning light. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the pavement. I hesitated for a moment before getting back into my car and heading toward Jake's place. The drive back felt like a blur. By the time I pulled up outside his apartment, my palms were sweaty, and my stomach churned with anxiety. I sat in the car for a few moments, staring up at his second-floor window. The curtains were still drawn, and everything seemed quiet. Too quiet. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I got out of the car and walked up to his door. My hand trembled as I knocked, the sound echoing unnaturally in the stillness. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. Jake? I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. When there was no response, I tried the doorknob. It was unlocked. The door creaked open, revealing the darkened interior of his apartment. The smell hit me immediately, a thick, acrid stench that made me gag. It wasn't the cozy cedarwood scent I had grown used to. This was something else. Something rotten. Jake? I called again, stepping inside. The living room was empty, but the signs of chaos were everywhere. Furniture was overturned, papers scattered across the floor. The once inviting space now felt hostile, alien. I took a tentative step toward the bedroom, where the door was slightly ajar. And that's when I heard it. A faint, wet, slurping sound. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around and leave. To run. But I couldn't. I had to know. I pushed the door open. Jake was sitting on the floor, his back to me. His head hung low, his shoulders trembling. Jake? I whispered, my voice cracking. He didn't respond. I took a step closer, and the floorboard creaked under my weight. His head snapped up, and he turned to look at me. It wasn't Jake. Or at least, it wasn't the Jake I knew. His eyes were sunken, rimmed with dark shadows, but it was his mouth that truly terrified me. Blood dripped from his lips, staining his chin and pooling on the floor in front of him. And in his hands, he was holding a severed hand. I screamed, stumbling back and falling against the doorframe. Jake, or whatever he had become, let out a guttural growl, his teeth bared. "They told me you'd come," he said, his voice a grotesque parody of his own. "They told me you'd try to stop it." "Stop what?" I managed to choke out. But he didn't answer. Instead, he lunged at me, faster than I thought possible. I barely managed to scramble out of the way, running back into the living room. I could hear his footsteps pounding behind me, his ragged breathing growing closer. I reached the front door and yanked it open, not daring to look back. I ran to my car, fumbling with the keys as I heard him scream behind me, a sound so inhuman it made my skin crawl. The engine roared to life, and I sped away, not daring to slow down until his apartment was far behind me. I didn't go home. I didn't go anywhere familiar. I drove for hours, eventually checking into a cheap motel off the highway. That night, as I lay on the scratchy motel bed, I couldn't stop thinking about Jake. About the journal. About the list. And then I remembered something. At the bottom of the list, beneath my name, was one final entry. It wasn't a name. It was a date. Tomorrow's date. I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. I don't know what I've gotten myself into. But whatever it is, I know I can't run from it. Because they're watching me. And they won't stop until they have what they want. The next morning, I woke to the sound of scratching at my motel door. And I knew they had come for me.